Hi Robin, thanks for coming down. I'd like to start off with a brief history of your involvement in Birmingham music.
Okay, I came to Birmingham in 1973 and I came to be a rock DJ at BRMB Radio, and BRMB Radio went on the air in 1974, and I did the rock show 5 nights a week. Normally it varied, but it was like 8 till 11 or 7 till 10 or varying on those times for about 5 years. Through until about 1979. So we're coming up, by 79 we're coming along to the beginning of two-tone and that area of music, and we've pretty much seen the end of the great traditional metal monsters of the 70s. After that I went on to the Late Show, which was basically still 2 hours of rock and then 2 hours of more experimental stuff you couldn't get away with at all on mainstream radio now. And that lasted for another 5 years or so, after which I pretty much went behind the scenes. I'd been involved in a range of specialist shows. I was also I'd done folk, I'd done classical, I'd done jazz, all of which I did with great enthusiasm. But I then got involved more in music programming. And the area of music programming, by the time we got to the mid-80s, was changing in radio, not necessarily for the best. There was a huge passionate argument about this, but basically what it meant was that the music running orders, the decisions on who played what music, was taken out of the hands of individual DJs, except in specialist shows, and given to one head of music who determined the overall programming that the station would follow. And there's all kinds of arguments about that. One of the arguments is that management has a perfect right to say what it wants to play on its radio station. And another argument is that some DJs can be spectacularly lazy about what they play and how they play it. This software came along and I thought, well, it's going to change the industry. It's already changed the industry in the States, and this might or might not be a good thing, but I think I kind of ought to find out about it. So I did, and dug into it, got quite good at it, and that's what I've been doing for the past 20 years since I left BRMB, is working on how people can use this software. It even took me to the States for a 10-year period working for the software house itself. But in terms of involvement with local music, you'll have to forgive me, I go off topic quite a lot. In terms of local music, before I came up to Birmingham, I obviously knew about the big bands that had mattered, that had come out of the West Midlands in the 60s and early 70s. So we're talking about Led Zeppelin and Traffic and
Sabbath, Slade,
Electric Light Orchestra. So I mean, a very heavy bias towards metal. So I knew about those, but then by the time I got up here, once you start digging around, it wasn't long before I ran into Steve Gibbons and started seeing Steve Gibbons' shows. And the first session that BRMB ever did, and I had to fight to get this session done. I had to get my program control to relax about taking a 4-track recorder into a club to record a band, and that was Gibbons. And it was a huge, huge success. And armed with that knowledge, I then wound up, jockeying quite a lot. I had a Sunday night residency at Barbarella's. It was almost always local bands. And it all went on from there. And one of the things that I came to the conclusion pretty rapidly was that in a town like Birmingham, in an area like the West Midlands, where there's so much talent emerging, that it's an absolute no-brainer to follow the bands that are developing, and when the time is right, do a session with the band or play their material, and then everyone wins. I'm not saying this is idealistic in any way. What I'm saying is it's solid business. You watch the band, you wait for the success, then you move. So you're exploiting the work that the band has already done, but of course the band is dead chuffed because they're getting some exposure on a radio station. And at the time, the audience figures that BRMB had were massive, so it was very useful for the band to get that exposure. The biggest impact, without a doubt, came with the UB40 session. What became the 4 tracks for their first album, an early mix, was a session on BRMB. And that had an enormous impact, and it led to a very positive spin-offs in all kinds of different directions. So most of the two-tone bands that followed in the Specials' footsteps wound up doing sessions for me at BRMB, and on it went from there. Ruby Turner, all those kind of people. The benefit to a radio station, I'm probably repeating myself here, is that the station gets this local notoriety, but it also gets a kind of virtuous glow from being the place that's got the hot new things that are happening. Now, we are definitely talking 20th century media here. I'm not entirely sure whether that can be said to apply in the 21st century, where radio is so much more diffuse.
So do you still think that that would apply to WM's introducing sessions, to Kerrang live sessions? Do you think they're not as important anymore, or do you think that...
I think both of those shows are excellent and should be commended and supported. I want to get that on record. I've said that before and I'll say it again. However, I think what both stations could do is to take the gems that they are unearthing in their areas and use them outside of ghettoized programming. I don't think it's a terribly good idea to just isolate stuff in there. Here's this little local box, and not play it at other times. I mean, consider this. If you have a band that happily puts 500 people into a room every time it plays, economically, that is more significant than the next number one from Jessie J in the market for the radio station. It's something I'd very much like to see WM do, and in fact, I think there are signs that that's happening now. Adrian Goldberg is definitely into music, and you will hear people doing live sessions on his shows in the middle of the day. I think that's excellent. I heartily approve. There is a mentality which I think is desperately conservative, that you have to play the hits and that you have to play what everyone else is doing. No, you don't. You have to play what is right for your audience, and that's an entirely different thing. Now, a lot of stations are driven by research, and the research systems are fine as far as they go. I've conducted music research. It was totally fascinating. By the time I'd done a 4 or 5 year run of music research at BRMB and at their gold station of the time, which was called Extra AM, both stations were enormously popular because it enabled me to identify stuff that actually mattered. But most research is conducted in a more defensive way than that. Most people will program a song providing it doesn't offend people. So it's defensive programming rather than proactive, let's dig up what really matters. Sadly, the way local radio has structured itself now is it's not really local. What we now have is brand radio. So what's happened in the West Midlands is that all the local stations, the remaining freestanding heritage local stations, have been grouped under one local banner. And they are competing against two major brands which are owned by the biggest company in the country, Global Media, I think their current name is, and they own Heart and Capital FM. Where, for example, an existing commercial radio station, and let's take free radio as the local competition, in my view, where they should go is to try and research where the differences are musically between what the London-based stations are offering their local outlets, what they can offer that's different, and one of the obvious differences would be a big local success. But we'll have to wait for that to happen before they can deliver that kind of thing. But it wouldn't be a bad way to start by messing around with some of their off-peak evening programming to see if they could identify some of those little successes.
Yeah.
This is something I've said 15 million times.
So, the next thing that I would like to know is if you don't think that radio is a viable local outlet for musicians at the moment, or as it currently stands.
I think it could be.
I think it still
could be. It really depends on. There's a lot of issues that you need to have to address, and I am not in the shoes of the people who are running local commercial radio stations anymore. What I can do for any radio station is go in and look at their music scheduling software and fix it so as it sounds fresher and better. But that's a mathematical exercise. I'm not telling them what to play. I'm saying if you play this, I can space it out so as it sounds better.
Yes. So with the advent of bands being able to possibly influence their own success and career through Facebook or through modern internet media. Do you think that helps bands?
I think it can do, but I think at the moment it's still very diffuse. I think there is a halfway house that the net could provide, and in fact it is providing at the moment, in that internet radio can now be delivered fantastically cheaply and fantastically well if you have the basic skills. You can get some kit online for web streaming for less than £200, which is perfectly capable of delivering you a radio station. I know a lot of people are doing that. The big issue with internet radio, of course, is that you have streaming costs, and if you're building up audiences of several hundred thousand, you're paying really high streaming charges. So that becomes self-limiting. That doesn't mean that you can't have a raft of interesting, adventurous, experimental radio stations delivering interesting material. I benchmarked about 20 bands' YouTube plays at the beginning of May, and I will come back at the beginning of June to see how many more plays they've added. The problem with YouTube, of course, is you can get 15 different versions of the same song. A band will put up several live recordings, and of course that dilutes the impact.
Yeah.
There's 2 or 3 bands who are starting to make a lot of noise, who got written up in NME recently. Peace, that's the one I'm thinking of. I think their videos had 20,000 plays, which is pretty spectacular from a standing start in only a few months. And then you come back down the line and you find some really brilliant stuff, but it's only had 500 plays. And you think, how come? This is great material. How come it's only had 500 plays? So what this is telling me is those plays are not being generated by the content. They've been generated by the buzz around that content. So we're still stuck with the same problem of generating awareness of the band before people will travel to the band. So the net is not an automatic way to bypass that. It does mean you can put yourself out to an audience, and you can reach an audience using the web. And I think that's a very fine thing for bands to be able to do. But it does tell me that you also then have to learn, just like as always, how to sell the material you put out for people to listen to.
So there still has to be a strategy, even if it's an internet strategy.
Absolutely.
You still have to have a good think about what you're trying to do.
And I think it's made it harder. I think the web allows you to record your material, to sell it, to publish it, to publicize it, but not everybody has those skills. Musicians are musicians. They make great music because they make great music. That doesn't mean they're great businessmen. In many cases, they're not. And one of the problems with a lot of musicians get is that with this great creative surge and whatever idealism or romanticism drives them forward, it's also moths to a flame, because someone will come along and say, I'll make this happen for you. And yeah, it makes it happen, but suddenly enough, they don't get the money.
But 75% of your earnings.
Exactly.
And every cup of tea that I make you will be charged for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that hasn't changed. That's been going on since the 50s. And I think it's tragic and disgusting that bands are still, it's still that moth to a flame scenario where you trust someone to make it happen for you. The bands who are best able to deal with the web, who are best able to deal with technology, with writing their own copy, with doing their own campaigns, tends to be nice, well-educated, middle-class white boys.
Yes, yes.
And
that will possibly have some financial backing.
Yes, and they might have a dad who knows something or another. So that means we're talking about a lot of folk, a lot of indie, a lot of shoegaze.
Mm-hmm.
And so someone who is a passionate, mad, hot, fantastically brilliant jazz guy who lives for his music isn't necessarily the best person to publicize his own material. And that's tragedy. So what I'm saying is that there are bands who can do stuff that is so miraculously fantastic that the musical possibilities that have emerged partly because of the web also are breathtakingly creative. There's several factors here. Factor number one, the record industry isn't the force it used to be, so nobody has to dance to some A&R man's tune to do what the A&R man tells them to do. That kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. And what we have now are thrilling bands who share musicians and who cross-pollinate each other and who exchange ideas back and forth. You also have dads and mums who were in the industry 30 years ago, whose kids grew up around them in the studios, who are comfortable with this. Fantastically creative stuff. It has never been better at a local level, in my view, and it has never been less exposed. Now, here's a hypothetical scenario which I attempted to put some flesh on the bones from this last year, and it failed because, again, money and the final link that was needed. I wound up programming an internet radio station this time last year, and it tied itself very closely to Birmingham. So I thought, all right, we've got all this fantastic Birmingham music that I happen to have a big juicy fat library that I'd built up over the previous 3 years of bands material. We're going to program that. And it was a very, very diverse range of material. And you know what? It sounded outrageously wonderful. It was fantastic. And anyone who listened to it said, oh God, that makes me proud. That was the general reaction. Where it fell apart was that the final link in the chain, and this is something that's absolutely essential, is that when the music comes up on the internet player, you need to know what you're listening to, you need to know what the band looks like, so you need all that extra bit of software development which will give you the links to the band's website, that will give you pictures, that will give you information about the band, and that's actually quite a lot of work. To put a database, a library of good music together is one thing. A lot of us can do it, you could do it, anyone in this room could do it. We've all got those ears that we've been listening to lots of different things. But then to add the extra bits and pieces together, the picture library that isn't going to be boring, the extra information about the band that is going to be refreshed fairly regularly, that's a lot of work. But if you can crack that nut, you can then deliver something at a relatively low cost, certainly far, far lower than a conventional radio station. Probably a 5-figure sum would do it, but you'd have to work very, very hard, and you'd have to have volunteers. Then you have something which could punch its weight.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your opinions and your time. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much.